A Madigan leaves state government. We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program about state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Andy Maloney, reporter for Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Welcome, Andy.
Good to be back, Bruce.
And also Mike Lawrence, retired head of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. Welcome, Mike.
Good to be here.
Great. Well, the big news hit last week, even as we were taping last week's program, the day after, in fact. Lisa Madigan announced that she will not be running for re-election next year, which has led to somewhat of a scramble for who will replace her, at least on the Democratic side. Before we get into talking about who is going to be running next year, let's talk a bit about Lisa Madigan herself. She's been in office now, will have been in office for 16 years. That's got to be, Mike, you have the more historic knowledge of than either Andy or I. How does that rate in terms of longevity for an Attorney General in Illinois?
Well, it's right up there. In fact, it may be at the top in that regard, at least in recent history.
Yeah, and she was in the state Senate prior to becoming Attorney General. I don't know that she's faced a particularly close election, certainly not in recent years. She said that she has no plans for the future. She has definitively or emphatically, as definitively as you can in politics, not ruled out a run for future elective office. Why did she leave at this point in time when a lot of folks thought that she was going to be a shoo-in? Is this stuff we're hearing about she might have been in more trouble than we think? Does that hold water at all?
I think you could make the case. This is someone who obviously has a lot of name recognition. On her own, she has been a very popular statewide official over the years. But as Governor Rauner entered the race a couple years ago and became governor, there's, I think, been a pretty concerted effort to make the Madigan name as detrimental as possible to Democrats of all names, including an official who shares that name, Lisa Madigan. So I think you could make the case that maybe it would have been maybe a little more perilous with, I think one of the last polls that I saw, it was months ago, but there was like the speaker had something like a 60%, 61% disapproval rating. So both he and the governor arguably were polling negatively after the budget impasse. So I think you could make the case that it would have been tough, but she would have been a tough opponent too. I mean, she has one Republican challenger so far, Erica Harold, who ran for Congress but has not held office. So, and she's got a long list of things that she could point to as accomplishments.
She had a tough race the first time she ran, and then has pretty much skated since then in her re-election bids. I have not seen polling, but I gotta believe she has suffered collateral damage from the attacks on her father. There's been millions of dollars put behind tarnishing the Madigan brand. And if Erica Harold had become the Republican nominee, and I think the chances are she's going to become that nominee. You have somebody who's a Harvard graduate, former Miss America, who presumably has the poise to handle herself well. And I think the campaign would have been about Mike Madigan, that campaign. And the Republicans certainly would have made it that. And this would have been the first opportunity that those folks in Illinois who have been turned off on Mike Madigan would have to actually vote against a Madigan. Right now, they haven't had that opportunity.
Sure, a proxy way to do it. I'd heard whispers, and emphasize whispers because you don't know how much spin folks are putting on. Some folks were saying from the Republican operative side, geez, I mean, she's below 40%, those sorts of things, which I don't know that's believable. But, I do think perhaps you're right. I mean, she was in for a tougher race than she'd had for years. And, it might have gotten pretty muddy and ugly at some point in time. Erica Harold. There's something about her that reminds me of Trump in a way, in an odd sense, in that she was not treated well by the Republican Party when she ran against Rodney Davis last time around. Does that help her or hurt her? I mean, how much money is she going to need to raise? Can she get it? What's the governor's position? Is Rauner going to come through with the money, or is that going to be an issue for her?
Well, if Rauner is for it, she'll have the money, and that will make a significant difference. You're right, they didn't treat her well when she ran in the primary. She was challenging Rodney Davis for the congressional nomination. He was the favorite of party people. So I have a feeling she's looking a lot better to him this time than she did when she was challenging Davis.
Yeah, I'd carbon copy that 100%. The Republican Attorneys General group nationally has already come out and said, hey, Lisa Madigan's retiring, stepping aside because she's afraid of Erica Harold. And so there is at least a little bit of, it seems at least, some party support. And as the only Republican challenger there now, and someone who was forward-thinking enough, I guess, to step into the race when Lisa Madigan hadn't stepped aside, yeah, I agree. I think it's a different situation this time.
Yeah, and I think, it's been a long time, if ever, that we've seen a resume quite like this. Miss America, Harvard, Republican in a central Illinois area. How is that, and if Kwame Raoul, we face the possibility of two African Americans facing off. What does that resume do for her? Does it hurt her? I mean, does the specter of being an outsider be an advantage? Is that an advantage coming in?
I think it could be, and even those the positions she took on a couple of issues, she was pro-life on abortion, and she was opposed to gay marriage when she was running for the congressional nomination. That could be a negative with voters, women voters in the suburbs who are crucial for any Republican running statewide. On the other hand, we're talking about the Attorney General here and that office, and I think there might be a certain appeal to particularly women voters in the suburbs to have a Republican, African American running, and we'll see what she does on those two issues. I think her more current answer has been that she'll enforce the law whenever it is.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see, we all know that a race like that doesn't take place in a vacuum. This is 2018, it's a midterm. We have a Republican, we have an unconventional Republican in the White House, to say the least, in President Trump. And so you could say that, perhaps historically midterms have been more the province of Republican voters, but on the other hand, it seems that Democrats would be pretty mobilized in this election to go out and just oppose Trump. And so we'll see how much salience, I guess, this type of race picks up. It is a statewide contest, but Attorney General, I think even with someone who's as well known in the state as Lisa Madigan was, is sort of a tough egg to crack for a lot of members of the public in terms of knowing the duties.
Sure, but she will get to go, she will have all the front runners on the Democratic side, all of them have been in government for a considerable amount of time. She would at least potentially, I think, have the ability to say, you are part of the issue here, and if I'm elected, I'm going to come after you. And that, I think, might have been one of the platforms or one of the things that Lisa Madigan may have been somewhat vulnerable on, in that, and this isn't just her, I mean, this is all attorney generals in Illinois history, they have not had a particularly strong record when it comes to going after corruption. That's something that they kick upstairs to the feds and have them do it. Madigan, to be fair, was investigating Rod Blagojevich. The feds took that one over, but most of the corruption election cases in Illinois have been handled on a federal level. That's something the AG could or should do in Illinois? Is that possible? Is that something that someone can raise as a plausible campaign issue?
Well, it has been raised, Bruce, as you know. The problem is those attorneys general who sought more power to prosecute public officials have not fared well with the Illinois General Assembly. Going way back to a guy named Bill Scott, he sought that power of being able to call a statewide grand jury. And he tried several times, was rebuffed. And then Ty Fainer, who was Attorney General, tried it, and he was rebuffed. The Illinois legislature has not been real receptive to giving an elected official, statewide elected official, the power to investigate corruption, including any corruption that they might be engaged in. Might be engaged.
Okay.
Right.
And so, what is Lisa Madigan's legacy going to be? I mean, 16 years in, how is she going to be remembered? What's her crowning achievement? What do you think?
It's a fascinating question. I think she's made her presence known quite a bit on consumer issues. Anytime there is something like, say, the Equifax hack, where a lot of consumer data has proved vulnerable, she's out there saying, we're going to figure this out. We're going to file a lawsuit. We're going to join in a lawsuit and try and bring back some benefit and get a settlement at least with a company like that. I think she's done a lot in terms of on the political side of things. That is part of her legacy too, right? Every campaign season we have this question of whether she was going to run for governor or what she thinks about her father's tenure in the legislature. So that is also part of the legacy as well. I think even something more recently, we talked about this before the show, just handling the cases. She has to play the cards that she's dealt a little bit, but there is some agency in terms of something like, how are you going to make an argument in a case like the pension reform case? How are you going to make arguments when there's no state budget and there might be some sort of legal backing for trying to go and get that state budget? She made some moves like that, and it'll just be a question of, I guess, how some of that stuff congeals in a few years.
Yeah, I think she's also been a champion for civil rights and equal rights. And the other thing is, I think she showed some gumption when she went to court to say that state employees should not be paid without an appropriation. Now, that may be an arcane issue I'm not so sure this show's viewers. I think they may well understand the significance of that.
She was trying to poke the bear and get something going.
And that was not a popular stand, particularly for a Democrat to take, to be in court saying that state workers shouldn't be paid. But I think she had a pretty solid basis legally for taking that position. How do you pay them without an appropriation?
And what she may not have had a solid basis for doing, but what she did anyway, was a few years back, she said, I'm not going to defend state law which bars gay marriage, even though that was the law.
Right.
And the lawyer, she's sworn, and that caused some controversy. Whether you like the law or dislike the law is the law, and you're the AG, it's you're supposed to defend it. And she said, I'm not going to do so. Is that going to help her in any future political endeavors? I mean, going along the civil rights issue.
I think it could help her, and I sure wouldn't write her off. But I think the Madigan brand has been tarnished. I think Governor Rauner has been far more successful in tarnishing the Madigan brand than he has been in getting support for legislation that he champions. And so, how long that'll last, who knows? But I think it's a significant factor. The other thing that occurs to me, she has been in office for 16 years, and regardless of whether people think she's done a good job, I happen to think she's done a pretty good job as Attorney General, but regardless of that, 16 years in a statewide office. Jesse White has been 20. He's running again. Well, you know, I think there's a real argument to be made for term limits for constitutional officers, but also a real argument for these folks, even if it isn't the law, to step aside voluntarily and make room for younger people, rising stars. Because what we've seen is, you know, people say, well, the Democrats don't have any bench, the Republicans don't have any bench. There's a reason for that, because there's not, you know, what's the point of being on the bench if you're not going to get in the game?
Sure. I mean, the General Assembly is not necessarily a good bench if you want to be governor.
Yeah, exactly.
So, along with, well, has there time, I guess, in this respect, when they were talking about the talk about Lisa Madigan becoming governor, that came along about the time of Rod Blagojevich. Was it then or never? I mean, was it?
It might have been. I say that just because, you know, that propelled the name recognition that she already had even a little more into the limelight. People from maybe outside the state who were checking in on this Blagojevich thing, they're like, oh, who's
Madigan the reformer.
Who's this? Yeah, right. Who's this, you know, AG who's been there for, it would have been something like 6 years, 8 years at that time, or however long, but has been there for a while and is out there and in this high-profile case. Maybe that was the time to come forward. I know she also discussed the issue of transparency with freedom of information laws, things like that. But I don't know, it's hard to do counterfactuals like that. We would have really had to see her sort of step into the race and see how that all shook out. I think even times after that, if she had put her name in the ring, we would have been talking about how she's a potential front runner, you know? So it's tough to say how that stuff would have shook out.
I think her time to run would have been 4 years ago against Pat Quinn in the primary. She'd have to win a primary, assuming Quinn would have stayed in. And then, but I think there was a very good chance that she would have been elected governor. As we know, in politics, timing is a major thing, and And I feel that her time was 4 years ago, and I think from her standpoint, and arguably from the standpoint of a lot of people who admire and support her, it was unfortunate her father would not step down as Speaker of the House at that time, so she could run for governor.
Well, moving on, I guess, to who might replace her, or at least run on the Democratic side. Boy, we got a lengthy field here. How many? Maybe it's easier to ask who's not running. Who are the heavies here? Who are the folks we need to be paying attention to?
Well, I think there are a handful of legislators who've at least know that, like State Senator Kwame Raoul, who you mentioned earlier, has already said, I'm going to step in, I'm going to do this. Scott Drury, who was previously running for governor, another Democrat in the House, who has not made a ton of friends in the legislature over the years, but is sort of running on that platform, like I'm not here to get cozy with people, is also in. But then you also have people like Representative Elaine Nekritz, who also had her hat in the ring for Auditor General a couple years back. Jack Franks, who was a previous House member, but now I think on the McHenry County Board, are some of the names that are kind of getting thrown out there. I'm sure, Mike, you probably know some others.
No, those are good ones to start with. Talking about Scott Drury, he's not only been an outsider, he's kind of been in Siberia, but he can use that. If he'd stayed in the House, it wouldn't have been helpful, because he's you know, if the nomination for Attorney General and election of the Attorney General was limited to a vote of people in the General Assembly, Scott would not do well. Let's just put it that way. But, you know, he's a former assistant U.S. attorney. He brings that up all the time, that he was a former prosecutor, and he has a legitimate claim, don't you think, Andrew, to being independent, at least independent of Madigan.
Well, Frank's, you know, let's talk about him for a second. How tough is that leap going to be, or potentially to go from a county board to AG? I mean, he had been in the legislature. Some would see the county board as a step down. At least that's what appears on surface. I mean, is that going to be a challenge for him, just by virtue if he's not in any kind of a state office currently?
I think it would be a challenge. I don't know what your take is on Jack Franks, Andrew, and Bruce, but he's a populist with a capital P. And I think he's the kind who'd be willing to go out and do and say anything and promise anything to get nominated and elected. And that kind of person is oftentimes tough to run against.
Sure.
Yeah, he's a populist who also knows how the system works too. He was in the legislature for a number of years. He was very outspoken in the legislature.
The maverick of the.
So he has a kind of he's a Democrat, but is kind of in a district or came from a district that has, you know, sort of a conservative, more of a conservative bent.
Definitely.
So I think he can play that hand. If he can play it well, he can credibly make the claim that, you know, I'm not bound to one party. Republicans have done things I didn't like, obviously, but Democrats did too. And this is how I pushed Speaker Madigan's buttons. This is how I pushed Governor Rauner's buttons, although he wasn't in the House for that long under Rauner. But so it'll be interesting to see if he does step forward and get in on that.
And then we have Representative Mike Hastings, a Democrat from Tinley Park, who's an either-or sort of person. He is circulating reportedly petitions both for Secretary of State and for Attorney General. Does he have a shot at either?
Well, yeah, another tough prediction question on. I think he hasn't been in the Senate that long. It's just a handful of years. I believe he went to West Point. He was a military veteran, and so I know that's important to a lot of people. He just got, I think, his law degree or passed the bar exam while serving in the legislature. So hasn't been an attorney for very long, but he can come in and say, you know, he's seen the way that the General Assembly works, and he's seen the way that the state works, and he's got ideas to fix it.
I think he's an up-and-comer, but I'm not sure this is his time.
Okay.
For either office.
Or either office. And since, I mean, his reason for circulating for Secretary of State is that Jesse might back out at the last minute. Is there any possibility that that's going to happen?
Well, I don't see it happening unless there's an extraordinary circumstance. But the fact is, one of the reasons he's on the ballot is because the head of the Democratic Party in Illinois, a guy named Madigan, wants him there because he's a big vote getter. And if Jesse runs and wins, and a lot of people think he will, if he's on the ballot, he'll win. And then if he were to resign, and in the meantime you had a Democrat elected governor, the appointment would be a Democratic appointment for a pretty significant office.
And then the anomaly here is state treasurer. Nobody's interested, apparently, except for the incumbent, Mr. Frerick. So what explains that?
Well,
at least nobody's come forward and said, yeah, I'd like to do this.
You know, I've watched Illinois politics for an awful lot of years, and I'm not aware of any 10-year-old ever in Illinois who said, when I grow up, I want to be state treasurer. It's just not that good a spot or that attract, but it can be a stepping stone, but as an office in and of itself.
It hasn't been, Mr. Rutherford didn't do well using it as a stepping stone. Judy Barr wasn't able to do it. Dan Hines wasn't able to do it.
Or Giannoulis, when he ran for the U.S. Senate from that office, didn't do well.
Okay. We're just about out of time, but before, let's get away from politics for just the last 2 minutes here. So let's talk about the backlog of bills, which now stands, as we tape this, at a record $16 billion after we've passed a budget to get rid of this backlog of bills. And now Governor Rauner is saying, we have a deficit and I need the help of the General Assembly to fix this. This sounds like deja vu all over. Why can't this be handled in a little more quiet way than it seems to be going forth?
Well, that's not Governor Rauner's MO, really. He likes to go out, I think, and anytime he can paint Democrats and the General Assembly, I guess more broadly, as being the problem, he's going to do it, especially this close to campaign season. There is precedent, though. Right after he was elected, there was something like a $1.6 billion hole in the budget that he and legislators were able to work together to patch. But that was obviously before we had the 2.5 or 2 years of stalemate where things got really ugly. So who knows if they're going to have any success in the upcoming months of fixing that.
My understanding of the Democratic position on this is there is money there. And it would be putting debt on top of debt, going out and borrowing, and supposedly temporarily, to make your debt service. And, I don't know that Rauner's strategy is going to work on this. I mean, his idea is put the Democrats in a position where they have to deal with him on other things to get the budget balance. Well, they argue it is balanced, but not only that, they've got appropriations for the kind of things they care about, right? They've got the appropriation. So where's the leverage?
It's an excellent question. I mean, they're going to say, the money's there, what part of we just gave you a tax increase don't you understand? That said, we're out of time, and so welcome, or not welcome, thank you for joining us again on Capitol View.